Thank you for joining us for today's digital discussion, California and Net Metering 3.0, the Future of Distributed Solar, presented by SEIA. The Solar Energy Industries Association is leading the transformation to a clean energy economy, creating the framework for solar to achieve 20% of U.S. electricity generation by 2030. SEIA works with its 1,000 member companies and other strategic partners to fight for policies that create jobs in every community and shape fair market rules that promote competition and the growth of reliable, low-cost solar power. Founded in 1974, SEIA is a national trade association, building a comprehensive vision for the solar plus decade through research, education, and advocacy. Thank you for your continued support. And now, let's welcome today's panelists and moderator.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Rick Umoff. I'm the Senior Director of California at SEIA. I manage that's SEIA's California policy work. And with us today, we have Delaney Hunter, a partner at the lobbying firm California Advisors based in Sacramento, as well as Tom Beach, SEIA's technical consultant in California, principal at Cross Border Energy. We're looking forward to a good, robust discussion today about the state of play in California's net metering proceeding, and a bit of discussion around sort of the future of DG tariffs, DG compensation in California, and the role of DG, the important role that DG plays in California going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Delaney Hunter to set the stage and talk a little bit about some of the policy and political dynamics at play as we work through this case in California. Delaney?
Thank you, Rick, and so excited to be here and talk to you all. As I was preparing for this, I got to do a little bit of a history lesson on NEM and recall the fun that we've all had in working on this important issue. NEM started in California, actually, with legislation that passed in 1995 that the commission here in California established, and NEM really kicked off in 1997. It was slow going at first, obviously. The amazing transformation of the industry that we are living through today hadn't really happened. But earlier in the 2000 decades, with the impetus of the California Solar Initiative, NEM really did take off. And that really was the basics and the basis by which the systems that are serving California residents and businesses around the state today really came to market. We affectionately refer to that period as NEM 1.0. And in 2013, the legislature, after sort of seeing what had happened with NEM 1.0 and with the CSI, sought to make some modifications to the NEM program. And under a bill called AB 327, it made some modifications to NEM. It removed what had previously been a program cap and removed what had previously included a project cap and pushed to the commission some key decisions about what the framework of net metering should look like, which the commission undertook. Other key provisions that were included in that space also did talk about the importance of the solar industry as an economic driver for the state, but also as a key piece of bringing renewables to the market and changing the makeup of the resources that serve California writ large. Obviously, climate change has been a key issue for California for a very long time, but I think at that point, it really was seen as the need to engage at every level customers in their energy choices and to allow for solar to be a robust business in the state. That period then led to what we call as NEM 2.0 is what we're living under today. Another key piece of that provision was really to drive additional conversation at the commission around the costs and benefits of solar. And that also is sort of how we ended up with where we're at today, which is NEM 3.0. And Tom will talk in depth about the odyssey that is the NEM 3.0 proceeding and the things that we in California are looking at. But lest we forget that the legislature is a pretty active body in the state of California and can't leave alone the key issues that drive us, energy being one of them. So there has been additional efforts to change the NEM statute. And most recently, there was a bill here pending that was titled AB 1139. It would have made pretty major modifications to the underlying NEM directive, would have really pushed the commission in a very specific way around what NEM 3.0 should look like. And more importantly, and I think probably one of the reasons it failed, made some pretty dramatic changes to tariffs that customers are already taking service under, i.e. changing the rules for those that have already made major investments in solar. That bill failed in June, and actually failed, I think, with a higher margin than I think lots of expected. It only got 27 of the 41 necessary votes. So the final vote tally was 27-27. I think that shows, one, the importance of solar as a resource for the state, but I think it also really shows the power of solar customers and them exercising their voices. We know from just anecdotal conversations in the Capitol that some offices were receiving between 900 and 1,200 calls on a pretty regular basis on the importance of maintaining solar as an option, maintaining people's investments in solar if they'd already done so, and really the importance of customers engaging in their energy use given all the things that the state faces. And those are innumerable. As a California ratepayer and resident who works in the energy space, sometimes it's overwhelming, and things are not always easy here. And obviously the game on the ground right now is tough. We are continuing to suffer under a historical drought that has led to some pretty draconian measures for water use. Also, California's energy system is heavily reliant on water, so we have lost the use of the hydro system at Lake Oroville for the first time in its history. That's a significant reduction in key resources. We continue to fight wildfires up and down the state. There are tons raging now. I think all of us are living under a cloud of smoke, whether you are in Southern California or Northern California. And as I mentioned with Lake Oroville, we are in a resource shortage relative to energy, which makes it extremely hard to think that there isn't a role and frankly a key role for customers engaging in keeping their own lights on, but also being part of an interconnected network that helps everybody keep their lights on in California. And lest we forget, we are still living in a global pandemic, and California continues to suffer some very high numbers of COVID, which means you need to ensure that hospitals have power and that vaccine coolers are on and are powered. So the issues around energy and climate are top of mind for most Californians and continue to drive sort of the policy framework and the policy landscape in Sacramento, but statewide. So in case that wasn't enough doom and gloom, I'm gonna kick it to Tom to kind of dive in deep, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the other fun things that are happening in California.
Thanks, Delaney. So I'm going to go through a series of slides here that hopefully will bring you all up to speed on what's going on in the NEM 3.0 proceeding at the California Public Utilities Commission. The status of that proceeding is that all the testimony has been submitted and the hearings were held in late July and early August, and the case is now in briefing. We expect that there will be a proposed decision issued in the case probably in the fourth quarter of this year, and the final commission decision could be as soon as 30 days after that, so late this year or early in 2022. So the first slide here kind of provides a context for the NEM 3 proceeding and the proposals that have been made. And this is, I think it's pretty fair to say these are points that I think all parties agree on in the case. They take different implications from them and have some very different proposals. But it's, as Delaney said, it's very clear that California's net metering program has been a success. There are over 1 million solar customers in California with about 10 gigawatts of rooftop solar installed. It's by far the leading state in the US in terms of amount of installed solar. It's about 10% of electric customers in the IOU service territories have solar. There's also a growing demand looking forward for solar paired with battery storage. That's responding to the customers' desire to have a more resilient electric service, have backup supply of electricity in the event of a power shutoff due to wildfires or other extreme weather or natural disaster type events. California is also moving to require residential customers, or at least to establish as the default residential electric tariff, a time of use tariff. And the investor-owned utility customers are being transitioned to that default time of use tariff as we speak. And so obviously there's a demand for storage to allow customers to do time of use arbitrage, fill their batteries up with solar in the middle of the day and discharge it during the evening peak period to realize, help manage the time of use rates. As Delaney mentioned, the state is also facing a critical need for new electric generating capacity. We had a couple hours of rotating blackouts in August of 2020. If the rooftop solar market transitions over the next decade to pair solar with storage, that could add 4 to 5 gigawatts of distributed storage by 2030. And that would be a significant contribution to meeting California's capacity needs. In terms of greenhouse gases, electrifying the California economy is the state's key strategy. That means that the state is hoping that customers of all types will make long-term investments in distributed resources of many types. That includes electric vehicles and heat pumps for space and water heating. Those resources, convincing customers to invest in those resources means you need a relatively low-cost source of electricity to power them. For example, electric vehicles, you have to be competitive with liquid fuels. And assuming that customers will charge their EVs at night and in the middle of the day during off-peak periods, what you really need is relatively inexpensive off-peak power. And there's certainly a demand from customers to be able to produce a portion of that power on their own premises using solar that they've put on their rooftop. I think there's also there is a recognition in the net metering proceeding that in the residential market in California, that the compensation for net metering 2.0 customers has gotten out of balance with the avoided cost benefits of rooftop solar. And the bill savings that solar customers can realize is in the 20 to 30 cent range, whereas the avoided costs that the utilities save when a customer installs solar are in the range of 10 cents or maybe even less than that, depending on which set of avoided costs from the CPUC you use. So there is a cost shift. And the question that the parties in this case are grappling with is how to address that cost shift. And it's pretty clear that there needs to be a reduction in the compensation for residential net metering customers. But the question is how far to move and how fast to move. So if we go to the next slide. This slide shows California's current, or this shows the resource plan that California approved in 2020. It's the reference system portfolio. And it's basically, I think, represents, there have been some slight modifications to this since then, but it's the basic electric resource plan for the state. And the light yellow portion of the bars is customer sited solar. And you can see that the resource plan has it growing from about 10 gigawatts in 2020, which is where we are today, to about 20 gigawatts in 2030. So the state is depending on customers continuing to install about a gigawatt a year of rooftop solar. And that's essentially the pace at which installations have been running for about the last 5 years. So the state is counting on customer solar showing up over the next 10 years. And the procurement that the CPUC has authorized for utility scale solar is based on projections that the growth of rooftop solar will be sustained over the next decade. So if we go to the next slide. So this presents the proposal that SEIA and Vote Solar presented in the NEM 3 case for residential customers in the general market for rooftop solar. There are two principal parts of the SEIA Vote Solar proposal. The first one, and I think as many of you are aware, under NEM 2, customers who install solar have to take service under a time of use rate. So the first element of our proposal is to, for NEM 3, is to require customers to use a particular kind of time of use rate. It's an electrification rate. These are rates that the CPUC has approved in recent years that are designed to encourage people to electrify their homes, purchase EVs and heat pumps. And they feature relatively high, I'm showing the Edison TOUD prime rate here as an example. As you can see, it has very high on-peak and mid-peak rates. That's during the 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. peak period. And it has much lower off-peak rates in both summer and winter. So our proposal is going forward, solar customers would need to be on one of these electrification rates. And then the other key provision is that we would move from net metering to a net billing arrangement. And the export rate, the compensation when you export power to the grid, would decline gradually in a series of steps. And the percentages shown here reflect the percentage of the retail rate under NEM 2 that would apply under NEM 3. So in the first step, the 100% percentage means that the export rate would be the same as under NEM 2. But in the second step, for PG&E and SDG&E, it would decline to 95%. In the third step, it would go down to 85% and so forth. If we could go to the next slide. These steps for reducing the export rate would be based on capacity installed, similar to the way the California Solar Initiative worked. And each step, the amount of capacity is shown there. It'd be 375 megawatts for PG&E. For Edison would be 260 megawatts, and for SDG&E 145 megawatts. So this is designed, each step is roughly 1 year of installations based on the pace at which rooftop solar has been installed over the last 5 years. And when you get to the end of a step, then the export percentage would move down to the next step. And it's important to recognize that our proposal is that these export percentages would be fixed for 20 years. So if you were in a step that had an 85% export percentage, your exports would be fixed at 85% of the retail rate, less certain non-bypassable charges for the next 20 years. And that's designed, of course, to provide the customer with some certainty over what export rate they would receive for the first 20 years that their system's in place. There's been a lot of proposals in the NEM 3 case for low and moderate income customers in California. California actually has had some success with getting solar penetration among low and moderate income customers. It's about, for example, about 5% of the utility customers who are on the CARE program have solar. You know, that does lag the 10% of the general market, but there are a lot of proposals to try to achieve more rapid penetration of solar and storage among low and moderate income customers. SEIA is supporting a proposal that a low and moderate income proposal that Vote Solar, Grid Alternatives, and the Sierra Club have advanced. Consistent with the state's goal to encourage electrification, SEIA's and Vote Solar's proposal would allow customers to oversize their system. As many of you know, generally in California, the systems have been limited to what the customer's annual electric usage is. We are proposing to allow customers to oversize their systems by 50%. And the thought there is that this would allow a customer who may want to install solar now, but they're also planning to buy an electric vehicle or install a heat pump for space heating and air conditioning, to oversize their system in anticipation of that higher electric demand in the future. The idea here is not to allow systems to be permanently oversized, because to the extent that your output exceeds your annual usage, the excess generation would be compensated at avoided costs rather than at compensation based on the retail rate. So the concept again is to allow customers to oversize systems with the expectation that they would grow into the system over time. SEIA and Vote Solar are not proposing any changes to the rules for NEM 1 and NEM 2 customers. As many of you may know, there's a 20-year legacy period provided in California where customers who are under NEM 1 or NEM 2 are assured that they will remain under those rules for a 20-year period. We think that's an important for providing customers with certainty that they can recover both the return on and of their investments in solar. And finally, this is NEM 3 is going to be a significant change to the market in California. I think regardless of whose proposal is adopted, we think there's going to need to be a significant period to implement the new program. We're proposing a 14-month implementation period, so that puts us into the first quarter of 2023 for implementing the proposal. And I also want to say that the SEIA, make sure everybody understands that the SEIA Vote Solar proposal really focuses on the residential market. We are not proposing any changes in the non-residential market. Our proposal is that the non-residential market would remain under the NEM 2.0 rules. So if we go to the next slide. So this slide is an effort to show graphically how our proposal deals gradually over time with the NEM cost shift. The red line the red dashed line at the top of the figure are the bill savings, residential bill savings from 2022 through 2030 under NEM 2.0. That's where we are today. And the orange, solid orange line are the bill savings under the SEIA Vote Solar proposal that requires the use of an electrification rate and then gradually reduces the export rate over time. And you can see that there's an immediate, in 2023, there's an immediate drop in the bill savings below the NEM 2 line, and that's due to moving on to the electrification rate. And then you can see that the orange line kind of gradually declines over the rest of the decade, and that's due to the gradual reduction in the export rate. Now, this picture, I should say, is for PG&E customers. Then the blue and green lines show the avoided costs benefits of residential solar as determined by the avoided costs that the CPUC has approved. The blue line show the 2020 avoided costs, which were in effect when this case began. And you can see that that the Vote Solar SEIA proposal, the bill savings reach the avoided cost line so that the costs and the benefits would be in balance in about the year 2027. But in May, the Commission revised its avoided costs in a move that was pretty controversial. And they actually reduced avoided costs by about 2/3. And that's the green line at the bottom. And so the SEIA and Vote Solar have proposed that we are very concerned about the volatility in the CPUC's avoided costs, changing by 2/3 in 1 year. It's not instill a lot of confidence in the modeling that's been used to produce those avoided costs. And where we are is that we have proposed that if avoided costs continue at the 2021 level, the green line, that we would continue to reduce export compensation for 3 more years until 2030. And so that's, you can see the orange line continuing to drop for another 3 years. There's some important context here. And one is that we are arguing before the CPUC that that trying to get to a zero cost shift is not a reasonable outcome, and that there are lots of there are other benefits that are not included in the CPUC's avoided costs. There's certainly a lot of societal benefits that have been brought into the case. In addition, utility scale renewables also cause a cost shift. And that's because the cost of renewables has been declining over time. So if I install solar today, it's going to cost more than if I install it 5 years into the future. And that's been true, of course, for decades now. So if the compensation that I need to make the solar panels that I install today economic is greater than the compensation that I'll need 5 years from now. So if you think about it, that guarantees that there will be 5 years from now, it'll appear that solar that was installed today is causing a cost shift. But it's really just a function of the fact that the cost of renewables has been declining. So from that perspective, a certain amount of cost shift is not a bad thing. It actually is a good thing. It means that the cost of renewables has been coming down. So if we go on to the next slide. So I have a couple slides here to talk about the proposals that other parties have presented before the CPUC. And there is a set of parties, basically the utilities, consumer groups, and NRDC have made proposals that have a lot of common elements. They're not identical. I think it's fair to say that the utility proposals are the most extreme, and the consumer group and NRDC proposals are not as adverse, but they all have certain common elements. The first of them is that these parties would actually use the avoided costs that from the avoided cost calculator that the CPUC has approved as the basis for export rates. And if you remember that green line from the prior slide, the ones they approved in 2021 are very low. Export rates would be in the range of about 3 cents a kilowatt hour for off-peak periods when most solar production occurs. These parties have also proposed very large fixed charges that would be based on the installed capacity of a solar system, the kilowatts installed. For example, PG&E and SDG&E are proposing $14 per kilowatt fixed per month fixed charge. So for a 5 kilowatt system, there would be a $70 per month fixed charge for residential customers who install such a system. The justification for these so-called grid benefit charges is to recover grid costs for the solar production that is used on site and never touches the grid. It's not to deal with exports, it's to deal with the solar that's used on site. And there's a significant cost causation issue here because that power never touches the grid. It's produced by the solar panels and used by the customer in their house. That use of solar simply appears to the grid as though the customer is imposing a lower load on the grid. In our view, it doesn't cause any cost to be incurred on the grid. So we are definitely strongly opposing these grid benefit charges. Some of the proposals include higher monthly fixed customer charges than apply to regular non-solar residential customers, up to $24 a month, which is SDG&E's proposal. And then today in California, solar customers true up, their bills are trued up once a year. There's an annual true up. And it's during that annual true up, you compare your solar output to your usage and determine whether there's any excess generation over the course of a year. There are a lot of proposals to move true ups to a monthly basis. That would potentially compensate a lot of solar output at a very low avoided cost rate compared to doing it on an annual basis. There's also proposals to move to instantaneous netting. Right now, the netting interval for residential in California is 1 hour. So if we go to the next, there we go. So the impacts of these proposals would be substantial. Bill savings would go down by 50% to over 75%. If there's a lot of testimony on the impact on paybacks, paybacks under NEM 2.0 are in the 5 to maybe 4 to 7 year range, depending on whether it's solar or solar plus storage. Under these proposals, the paybacks appear to us to be 17 to over 20 years. And that's a simple payback. That's just the cost of the system divided by the first year bill savings. If they're financing costs, then the paybacks would be even longer. There are, for solar plus storage systems, would be able to have somewhat higher bill savings under time of use rates, but the impact on solar plus storage paybacks would be somewhat less than 17 to 20 years, but would also be in the well over 10 years. I think that a lot of parties have realized that paybacks this long are unlikely to be attractive to customers. And so they have proposed offsetting upfront incentives that would be designed to produce a 10 or 15 year payback. For example, NRDC's proposal is that there would be offsetting incentives to produce a 10-year payback. The consumer group Turn has proposed a 10-year payback for low-income customers and a 15-year payback for regular customers. The impact of this is if you actually calculate the kind of incentives that would be necessary, they're pretty large. In the range of perhaps $5,000 to $10,000 per system. And there's in some proposals, the incentives would cover up to 80% of the cost for low-income customers, the cost of the system. And bill savings would therefore play a much smaller role in compensating solar customers. This kind of paradigm where a large part of the system's paid for in an upfront incentive, but the customer doesn't save much money over its lifetime, really it would be a substantial change for the industry, and it would put a lot of pressure on the process for determining who would get these incentives, how they would be funded. There's some proposals to fund the incentives from tax revenues rather than from utility rates. So it would introduce a lot of uncertainty in terms of customers' ability to obtain these incentives. And finally, there are some proposals to impact NEM 1 and 2 customers. For example, there's some proposals that have to kind of shorten the legacy period for NEM 1 and 2 customers and require them after a shorter period of time than 20 years. I think there's some proposals for after 8 years to require NEM 1 and 2 customers to move to NEM 3. There are proposals to require NEM 1 and NEM 2 customers to fund some of the incentives for low and moderate income customers through a special charge on them. And there are proposals to provide incentives for NEM 1 and NEM 2 customers to add storage to their system. And we've indicated that we think that a program to incentivize NEM 1 and NEM 2 customers to add storage is something that is worth considering. That's using a carrot to persuade customers to add storage, and it doesn't affect the customer's ability to stay on NEM 1 and NEM 2 to recover their investment if that's what they want to do. So I'll move on to the next slide. So this is sort of the final slide and kind of sums up the issues that are before the commission. The first one is gradualism. Our proposal, I think, as you could tell, is based on gradual change over the coming decade for rooftop solar customers, whereas some of the utility and consumer group proposals would have change happen much more dramatically. There is, as Delaney mentioned, there is legislation in California that says that this market should continue to grow sustainably, and so the commission is going to have to grapple with what is sustainable growth. I think there is a broad recognition that solar plus storage is the future. It dramatically increases the value of distributed solar and responds to customers' desire to improve the resiliency of their electric service. So the commission needs to see if it can craft a NEM 3 program that can allow that to happen. I've talked about our perspective on the cost shift and how expecting the cost shift to be reduced to zero is not a reasonable goal, because in a world where renewable costs are declining, any type of renewable is going to cause a cost shift. And the problem with being too draconian about preventing cost shifts is you may end up with nobody building anything. And the ratepayer impact measure test that is the most stringent test of cost shifts has been called the hardly any winners test by the consultant Amory Lovins of Rocky Mountain Institute. The problem with it is that the RIM test is a test that it guarantees that there are no losers. And the problem is that if you apply it too stringently, you're going to have very few programs that pass it, and you won't do anything. There's a very important issue in this case about whether solar generation that's used on site causes the utility to incur any costs. And there are issues around what kind of certainty should customers have when they make investments in distributed resources, and whether certain types of distributed resources like solar are going to be disfavored because they produce energy, as opposed to other distributed resources like electric vehicles and heat pumps that are favored because they increase electric use. And finally, it is very important to recognize that the cost shift issues become less important if everyone has equitable access to solar. And so a large part of this case is hopefully intended to make progress in that area, so everyone in California has more equitable access to solar, and hopefully that will lower the temperature on some of the cost shift issues. So that's my presentation.
Great, thanks, Tom. Well, we're going to go next to a little Q&A. We're getting a number of questions in here. The first question I have received is on a pretty key topic in California with the wildfires and the power safety shutoffs. I think I'll start with you, Tom, which is how do we address the value of resiliency, and how does that factor into the Commission's considerations of distributed solar here?
Yeah, if one thing I didn't get to point out in that the slide showing the SEIA proposal and how it addresses the cost shift, there were two, for the avoided costs, I showed two different lines. There was a solid line and a dashed line. The dashed line was higher because that line included some resiliency benefits. And our view is that resiliency is a broad benefit for all ratepayers. If you live in a community where the fire station and the community center and your neighborhood block captain or neighbors of yours have resilient electric service in the form of solar plus storage, that's a good thing for the entire community, and that everybody benefits from that. In a natural disaster, it's the kind of circumstance in which neighbors are going to be helping neighbors. And so the broad diffusion of solar plus storage systems is a benefit for everyone and should be treated that way.
Thanks, Tom. And before we move to another question, I'd be interested to get your take, Delaney, on sort of the role that resilience, wildfires, the increasingly kind of unreliable grid is, how is that conversation taking place in Sacramento amongst policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, the real issue of resiliency came to California late, frankly. I've been frankly surprised that it took massive wildfires starting in 17 and 18 to really start to think about the need to keep the grid up during key periods. I think the East Coast post Hurricane Sandy really kind of figured out what the grid needed to manage itself during certain circumstances. And California, frankly, was late to the show. And I think we, frankly, are still late to the show. That doesn't mean that we're not out there working, but we really haven't embraced, I think, some of the benefits and the things that distributed resources really can do in times of crisis to keep things going and keep things going in a clean way. In fact, what I think what's happening is we're in a little bit of a panic mode, which is leading to an explosion in the use of diesel, which is not exactly where California should be going, given our just inherent problems with air quality generally, but sort of the climate threat that we as a state, but we as a world are facing. So I think the resiliency issue is top of mind for policymakers, but I think they have yet to recognize that it takes more than just crisis, and that you have to contemplate the economics of making resiliency be a value for the system to really get that activity to drive.
Thanks, Delaney. And just a reminder to folks, you have questions, you can put them in the chat. We can pick those up and respond. One question we're getting a kind of a theme of a few questions is around payback periods, and maybe this one's good for you, Tom. A number of the parties, it looks like, put forward proposals that have fairly extensive payback periods. Be interested to get your take on sort of how you think the commission is going to view that and how they're going to balance that against the other considerations they're making in the case.
Yeah, that will be it'll be very interesting to see where the commission comes out on that. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence in the case about other states that have reformed their NEM programs, and that includes Arizona, Nevada, South Carolina, Hawaii. And if you look at those markets, generally, you see paybacks of 10 years or less, and those markets have continued to grow after they've reformed their net metering program. Although in the cases of Hawaii and Nevada, there was a pause until they got it. They had some initial difficulties getting it right. But those markets have continued to grow after NEM has been reformed. But those markets do have paybacks of 10 years or less. So from that evidence, I think the commission hopefully will consider that carefully and and make sure that the program that it adopts for California is in that range such that the market continues to grow sustainably.
Thanks, Tom. And we did get a question, and perhaps this is for you again, Tom, sort of around some of the other proposals that are in the case we haven't touched on. For example, the California Solar and Storage Association put forward a proposal, and where kind of our proposal stacks up against that one. I think it's pretty fair to characterize it. It's pretty similar in terms of its structure and step down in terms of gradualism. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, that's correct. I think the one element that's not in the Cal SSA proposal that's in our proposal is moving to the use of the electrification rate. But otherwise, the Cal SSA proposal is also for a gradual step down in the export compensation. So they are, closely. They're not identical, but they're closely aligned.
Thanks, Tom. And just a reminder to folks, if you have additional questions, you can put those into the chat. Delaney, I want to turn to you a little bit, just quickly here to talk a little bit about sort of going into 2022. It's an election year. There's a recall on the horizon here. How do you think some of those politics will influence the energy conversation in Sacramento, and specifically around the role of distributed resources and customer kind of sited energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the recall is essentially the thing that everyone's talking about in California, and having lived through the last one, I can understand why. It is the stuff of political junkies' dreams, but it really is, it is something that could be very impactful to the things that matter. Considering the potential for a recall to actually be successful, I think it's tighter than most folks anticipated, and some believe that is directly attributable to Governor Newsom's activities around wildfire and rolling blackouts. I think the other thing is that, of the 46 different candidates, 5 of which their names are Kevin, they are mostly Republican, and Republicans have not always been the most favorably inclined towards clean energy, green energy. Obviously, we have some exceptions in California, but they also tend to be more directed around big central station traditional power generation. And so I think there's some worry, frankly, that it could be seen as stunting to the future of DER, and stunting to the future of clean energy in California. I think it would also just frankly lead to a little bit of political chaos. Interestingly enough, even if a Republican takes office, the legislature is dominated by Democrats, more than 2/3 in both houses, which means that they could essentially override any veto or any action of a Republican governor, which may just frankly lead to some standstill. Obviously the administrative agencies that sit in California, of which there are many, and they are powerful, but they do take political direction from their chief executive, and that I think could also lead to some chaos if in fact there is a change of leadership in the governor's office. In the event that Governor Newsom holds on, he will be up for re-election though almost immediately. So the primary is in June. General is in November of 22. He plus all other statewide officers are up. The full assembly is up. Half of the Senate is up, and all congressional seats for the House of Representatives are up. We are also in the midst of redistricting, and so things will change in districts, and we are actually anxiously awaiting all of those changes in California. We will be losing a congressional seat. Where is unknown. So the political sands are shifting, and it's it's going to be hairy, needless to say, until the end of 22, when we know where things shake out. And on all of that, amidst what folks expect is continuing drought, continuing wildfire threat, continuing resource shortages. So California is often seen as graduate level democracy. I think we are heading for PhD level democracy in California at this point. It's tough stuff, but I think if we can figure it out here and we can get it right here, is usually the case. We tend to, let that spread across the country. So if we can figure it out and get our heads about us and manage things in the right way, hopefully we could be seen and continue to be seen as a model for the country, but also a model for the world. So I'm hopeful still.
I like that. And we did get a question about whether you're aware of any specific legislation that's active currently around the issue of net metering. I don't believe there is.
No. So the big bill that was impactful on NEM was failed in June. There isn't any currently pending legislation relative to NEM. The one caveat I will mention is that California's legislative rules do allow for things called gut and amends. So it's possible that a bill could still be amended and try to make it through. But given the vote on AB 1139, and I think given the other things that the state is facing, I don't believe that it's likely that anything would pop its head up before session wraps up on September 10th.
Thanks, Lenny. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions here. So Tom, turn it back to you. We are getting some questions about the commercial side of the industry. We haven't talked as much about C&I systems and tariffs for C&I. And we did. You did say that our proposal does not include major changes for C&I. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening in that space and why perhaps a separate treatment for C&I?
Sure. So the C&I market in California has been fairly stagnant for the last few years, and the residential market has assumed a greater share of the distributed solar market in the state, and that's, I think, largely due to the fact that the time of use rates in California have shifted to an evening 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. Peak period, and that's had a significant impact on the C&I market. And ultimately, probably the solution to that is storage, so that you can install solar and then shift the solar output into the 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. peak period. But it may take a number of years for the C&I market to turn to storage. So it's our view that given the slowdown and given the time needed to adjust to the new time of use periods, that it made sense to stay under the NEM 2.0 rules for the C&I market. There are proposals from the utilities to apply some of these fixed grid benefit charges and low export rates to the C&I market, which obviously would not be a positive development for that market either, just as it would have a significant impact on the residential market. So we're going to, that's also before the commission.
Thanks. And I'm going to turn that question to you, Delaney, to wrap it up, which is, I know you work a lot also on the commercial side, and what are you hearing from project developers or their customers around the need for reliable power as we go forward here?
Yeah, I mean, I think sadly, C&I is a class that I think gets beat up a lot. Just I've worked in that space a very long time, but more importantly, they are they are increasingly the drivers of not only our economy, but our society. If you contemplate what we're doing today, this webinar couldn't happen but for data centers and rack systems that maintain the internet and the Internet of Things. And one thing I can tell you about those customers and that commerce is they have zero tolerance for power outages. And I mean zero, which means they will make economic decisions, frankly, climate and sustainability to the wind to ensure that they can maintain themselves. And we, frankly, in society need them. Like, I can't imagine if we didn't have the ability to have internet during the pandemic, or the ability to maintain freezers for vaccines and to maintain hospitals for COVID management. So that group of customers are increasingly driven by resiliency more than economics. That doesn't mean that economics don't matter, but they really are driven around resiliency, and they are looking for products that can do that. So in most cases, if it's a big C&I customer, they're probably going to have solar plus storage, maybe a backup, maybe a fuel cell. They're gonna take as many resources as they can to figure out how to keep their lights on and keep the things that they do for our society and for the economy going. And I think that's key, and we need that. Hopefully they will continue to keep solar and storage at the forefront and rely on that and stop using diesel as much. But I think the economics of making those decisions and keeping things like diesel off are going to be key as we think about how unstable the grid is in California on a go-forward basis. And I think, that class of customers are increasingly becoming vocal, as they rightly should, to making the right decisions around energy, and the state making sure that they can make those choices.
Great. Well, thanks, Delaney. We'll end it on that note. A lot happening here in California. Stay tuned on the net metering proceeding here, where SEIA is very active with its partners. I want to thank our panelists here, Delaney Hunter and Tom Peach, for joining us, and thank you all for joining us today as well.
Thanks all.
Thank you for joining us today. If you're interested in hearing more about membership with SEIA, please reach out to membership@seia.org.